Well, greetings once again. I am Michael Hinkson, and you are listening to Unstoppable Mindset. I want to thank you for being here today. I hope that you enjoy what we get to talk about. We are talking with Alan Garcia, who has a very interesting story in a lot of ways to talk about. Alan is still in New York, right?
That's correct.
There you go, in New York City. Where in New York City?
I'm in Manhattan.
Perfect. Well, Alan, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset.
Thanks for having me. This is exciting.
Well, so let's get right into it. I'd love to learn a little bit about you, maybe growing up and talking about your childhood. And I know you have quite a story to tell, so I'm just going to let you go to it.
All right. Thanks, Michael. The story begins. My earliest waking memories, if you will, are on a Greyhound bus ride from a small little town in central Mexico all the way here to New York City. So I was born in Mexico, in the town of Acámbaro, which is a small, rustic town 4 hours north of Mexico City. So right smack dab in the middle of the country. And my mother happened to be born here in New York. So she grew up here. But when she was a teenager, her parents split up. So her mother is Mexican descent. And her father, my grandfather, is an immigrant from Poland. When they split up, my mother was spending a lot of time back and forth between the two countries as a kid, as a teenager. And so when she became an adult at the age of 18, she decided to leave New York City for what she thought at the time was for good and moved to Mexico. And my sister was born there. I was born there. But fast forward, I guess my sister was 7 years old. I was 4 years old. 1994, North American Free Trade Agreement hits Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And my parents had a small business. You could think of it as the intermediary between farmers and market. So kind of the middle of that part of the business. And my parents were very young, had children very young, got married very young, maybe a little bit over their heads as far as the amount of responsibility. But NAFTA actually caused my parents' business to go bankrupt. Inflation hit Mexico very hard. It was good for big business, but not necessarily for the little guy. So my parents decided to put whatever resources they had left together, and we could afford 3 bus tickets, 3 coach bus tickets, one-way tickets from Mexico to New York. And my father could not come with us at the time. And
because you couldn't afford the 4th ticket?
We couldn't afford it, but there was also some issues with his paperwork, to be honest with you, Michael. At the time, the government, both the American government and the Mexican government, were trying to really clamp down on folks leaving Mexico and fleeing the inflation and the economic turmoil. The violence and the drug cartels at the time had gotten a hold of a lot of businesses. Opening up the markets did a lot in terms of opening up both the legal trade and the not so
legal trade. Yeah.
So my mother is right. She's born here in New York, so she's an American citizen. There's many things I'll never be able to repay my mother for, and one of them is the fact that when my sister and I were born in Mexico, my mother filed for dual citizenship for my sister and I. And so my sister and I legally have a consular birth abroad. And she figured that if nothing else, our citizenship is the most valuable thing we have, our dual citizenship. So the government did not think that let me put it this way. The government thought my parents were married under nefarious circumstances. They thought my father married my mother for citizenship, which was not the case. My father never became an American citizen. And so he could not come with us, and to avoid sort of any legal troubles, my mother said, hey, I'll take the kids to New York, take them to their grandfather's home in the Bronx, and we'll start from scratch there. Either we start from scratch in Mexico because we're bankrupt, or we'll start from scratch in New York, in the land of milk and honey, so to speak.
Potential.
Where the streets are paved in gold, as they say. and the kids will start there. So it was a week-long bus ride. We ended up right in Times Square, Midtown Manhattan, Port Authority bus terminal. Took the one train, the local, and still to this day very local one train.
Yes.
Up to the Bronx. And it's funny, Michael, I remember my mother vividly before we left Mexico said, Alan, pack the most important thing you can think of. We don't have a lot of space, small little toddler-sized book bag. And of course, the most important thing at the time for me were my Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle action figures. That was the most important thing I could think of. And it's interesting, on my mantle here in my living room to this day, I have one of the 4 action figures left. It's Donatello, aka the purple Ninja Turtle. He made the journey, and he's been with me literally my entire waking life.
Dude.
That's right. And so, we show up in the Bronx, and I would learn years later, Michael, that my mother was very weary of telling her father that we were coming back. If you could think about it, when she left at 18 years old to go start a family, my grandfather was very upset and disappointed. So she said, well, the greatest leverage I have is his grandchildren, who he can't say no to. And of course he did not. So he welcomed us with open arms. And we settled in there in the Bronx in his 1-bedroom apartment. Went about a year without my father. My mother was very intentional about us keeping in touch with him. But again, this is 94, 95, and a long distance phone call to Mexico, quite expensive in those days. So I remember on Sunday evenings, late night, my mother would huddle with my sister and I on the phone and leave us about maybe 10 minutes to speak to him. And she would show us a picture while we were talking to him so we could visualize what he looked like. She didn't want us to forget what he looked like, given particularly me that I was younger. And so this voice that I would hear on Sunday nights, she would say, Alan, that's your father. That voice that you hear, that ominous voice you hear on Sunday evenings is your father. And then sure enough, about a year later, we would reunite. He actually went to Los Angeles first. He had some friends there, a potential job. My mother flew us out to go see him. And naturally, I thought he worked at Disneyland because that's where he took us. And my father said, no, I don't work here. This is not what I do. I remember the Lion King and the Simba parade. And he said, no, I thought my dad was the coolest guy ever. And I still think that. But at the time, I thought, wow, this is so much nicer than the cold and bitterness of New York City. But my mother said, no, you have to come back to New York with us. And my father, if you could imagine, Michael, he had never really met his father-in-law, right? My grandfather his prospect was, I'll show up to New York City with no job and have to support my family and live in my father-in-law's 1-bedroom apartment, bumming on his couch, trying to raise his grandchildren and be the husband to his daughter. So my father had to swallow his pride and do what my mother thought was the best for us. And so we all moved back. And then my estranged grandmother, like my grandfather's wife, who they had separated in the mid-'80s, she got wind of this. She was living in Mexico and she moved back to New York. So all 6 of us by 1995 reunited in my grandfather's 1-bedroom apartment in the Bronx. And although at the time, I'm sure from my parents, from my grandparents, a very overwhelming proposition, for me as a young child, I had everything I could ever want. I had my family, my parents, my grandparents, my sister, everybody working to make ends meet, everybody pitching in to turn, frowns into smiles and to make sure my sister and I never wanted. We didn't have much. My grandfather drove a yellow cab in New York City for 50 years.
Where was he from originally?
So he's from Poland.
There you go, another immigrant.
And he passed away a few years ago, but he grew up in hiding in Nazi-occupied Poland during the Second World War. And so when the war ended and Soviet Union came in, he was a bit of a troublemaker. He was not a big fan of communism or the communists. And his mother, my great-grandmother, would always fear that his outspokenness would get them in trouble. So she basically disowned him when he was a teenager He was about 17, and she said, you're going to get us all in trouble. We did so much to just survive the war. Why can't you just shut your trap and and do what you're told? But that's not the type of man he was. So he left his native land, emigrated to New York. You know, the whole Ellis Island story, from London to New York. And so it's interesting for me growing up in an immigrant household. You know, I have my immigrant story, my sister as well. My mother's technically not an immigrant, but was straddling two worlds her whole life. My father's an immigrant, and my grandfather, very heavy Polish accent. I mean, a prototypical middle-aged Polish man by the time I met him, and he and I looked very, very different. We sounded different. We had very different last names. And as a kid, spent a lot of my time in his yellow cab, driving around the city. I mean, that was his version of babysitting. It was, Alan, let's go to work. And so spent a lot of really good memories in the front seat of his cab, and hearing him talk to whoever got in his cab and share stories and find commonality. I mean, you step into a cab, you never know who's going to get in and what story you're going to hear. So just the way he was able to laugh and joke and ultimately get a perhaps more generous tip out of his business. It was for me, looking back, there was so much difference in my childhood between language and cuisine and customs and just trying to assimilate. Difference was very normalized for me. I mean, no adults in my life were intentional about teaching us about difference. I think it was just so organic and part of our survival that, looking back, it was a real blessing to be in a trilingual, multi-ethnic, multinational household and have to navigate those spaces. I remember as a kid, my father going to parent-teacher conferences at school when I'm in elementary school, and he didn't really understand English. So I'd have to translate for him what the teachers were saying. And then when we got home, my grandfather, who was, you know, fluent in English and Polish, but he didn't know any Spanish, despite being married to a Mexican woman in his younger days, he would talk about me with my report cards. And I would have to translate to my father what my grandfather was saying, and vice versa. I would have to translate to my grandfather what my father was trying to tell me in Spanish. And so my mother was very insistent on us learning multiple languages, keeping our native tongues. And to be honest with you, Michael, she didn't want my sister and I to speak with an accent. She had seen some of the bullying or some of the teasing that can happen both in Mexico and in New York when that happens. And so she wanted us to speak fluent English, but also not forget, quote unquote, where we came from. Mm-hmm. And again, all these things were just organic. They weren't explicit lessons. They were taught to us. And looking back, the career I've had as an educator or just a citizen of this city, of this country, of this world, I think it was a huge blessing in disguise.
Well, it's interesting. You describe something I've heard so many times, even from other people who immigrated to the United States and talking about their families. It's the values. It's the mindset that parents have that really teaches and taught you so many things. One, to value what you had, to remember where you came from, to understand that it's okay to be different, and that we're all part of the same world, but that you can go from a really hard time and a real time of hardship to things being better. I was thinking, you came to New York on a bus, you didn't have any money, but within a year, your mother was able to fly you all out to Los Angeles to see your father. And that had just immediately made me think, well, you earned enough money, or not you, but your family earned enough money to be able to do that. So clearly there was some rightness in that decision. And I think your parents were probably people who wouldn't forget all the realities and the value that moving to America brought, but all the value that where you came from taught them and you to be able to thrive and be better people for it.
Oh, certainly. Oh, certainly. I mean, from a young age, I mean, even to this day, having a strong work ethic was the universal language.
Yeah.
And I say that tongue in cheek because there were multiple languages spoken around me
Yeah.
and in our household, but my father was working, odd jobs. My mother not only was working as soon as she got back to New York, she was going to college. And so I saw my mother graduate from college when I was in fourth grade. And again, that normalized for me. Oh, I guess when you're older and you look like my parents, you just go to school, right? As an adult. And so I remember my sister and I, our routine was we walk to school together. We get out of school. We're put in the after school program. My mother picks us up. She worked in a banking, in finance. And so at a local branch by our elementary school, we would close down the branch with her, 5:30, 6 p.m. Eastern. We'd go home, have a little snack break, and then we would attend her night classes for years. And so she went to Manhattan College, a local college by where we grew up in the Bronx. And she would come into the college with her two kids, and she would say, "Hey, Alan, Lily," that's my sister's name, sit in the library or sit in the hallway. And if you have homework to do, just, get to it, and I'll answer any questions when I'm done. We wouldn't get out of there until 8:30, 9 p.m. We'd get home. We'd have another snack. My mother would help us with our homework, and we'd repeat, wash, rinse, repeat every day. And so it was very, very, very routine heavy. A lot of rituals, if you will. Every now and then, my mother built a really nice rapport with her professors and her classmates, and they were always so intrigued that she had these little kids so well behaved in the college. And so sometimes we would be able to peek into a classroom or get a tour of a space in college. And again, Michael, looking back, what a blessing that I'm 7, 8, 9 years old and I have exposure to a college campus. I have exposure to a professional workplace where my mom is, working. And I remember I looked at my friends' parents and I said, man, every parent does this. and sure enough, that wasn't the case. But again, that was normalized for me. And my grandfather, right, working 15, 16-hour days in a cab. Even my grandmother, she was working part-time at a bakery in the neighborhood. And you're the coolest kid in the neighborhood when you can walk into a bakery and get free cookies.
Yeah.
So it was, now that I'm an adult, obviously, and I'm older and I can really see this with a different perspective, everybody working to make ends meet, everybody pitching in, again, to make sure my sister and I, never wanted, but also saw that life is about working hard and doing it together and reaping the benefits of that. So that really was the universal language, to your point, about values and a work ethic.
But there was also a lot of love. And that is something that clearly surrounded you and your sister, but that was created in that whole family environment.
Oh, yeah. It was, and so you mentioned love and I think about my older sister, and she was older than, she's older than me. So she's really seeing everything first in this country, right? She's going to school before me. She's seeing the middle school years before me. She's entering adolescence before me. And I remember from a young age, she would come home, especially when I was a little younger and spending more time with my grandfather. My sister would say, Alan, the kids in the neighborhood are going to say we're different. They're going to say we're not from here. So talk about this. These are the cool things to talk about. Or I'll give you another funny example. My mother would pack our lunch, right, in the morning, as most mothers do. And in the beginning, she was packing us some leftovers from the night before, right, to save money. And we did not have a school cafeteria where we went to school. So you're eating normally things that your parents prepare for you. And my mother would pack some leftover Mexican food. And the kids would tease my sister for it, or, oh, what is that? It smells kind of funky, things like that. And my sister would come home and say, Mom, please don't pack Alan with that lunch. He's going to get made fun of for it. Pack him something called a turkey and cheese. And I was like, what's a turkey and cheese? And so my sister was, in her own way, trying to protect me and kind of, to your point, love me in a new way, that she didn't want me to go through some of the hardships she went through. And again, I'll never be able to repay her in a sense for those things. But then my family's saying, okay, I guess, we're going to have to change the way we do things to give Alan and Lily a different, maybe even better experience than we had as kids. And so there's a lot of love that goes into that. You know, my parents, God bless them, they've never been the parents to say, oh, you know, we did it this way, so you have to do it this way. Or the prototypical back in my day, right? My parents got married real young. Relative to my sister and I, they're still relatively young. So their whole philosophy has been, who are we to judge you and tell you how to live when the whole world doubted us, right? The whole world never thought we'd make it to this country in the first place. So a lot of love and humility goes into that.
Did you get treated in any different way? Were you bullied, or did you look different enough, or in anywhere were you considered, and your sister and you're referring to it a little bit, but were you different enough that it really ended up being a significant problem, or did looks have anything to do with any of that?
Yeah, it was definitely there. I grew up, and if you ask any of my childhood friends, there were no Mexican families in our neighborhood. In that particular area of the Bronx, we stood out like a sore thumb. No Mexican families, few folks of Hispanic, Latino descent generally. And so we did stick out. Again, we spoke a different language amongst each other than most of the kids spoke of the neighborhood. So that was definitely noticed. And just being immigrants generally, you know, the proverbial, you're not from here, go back to where you came from, those kind of things that just, you know, happen in the playground or amongst kids. And that's, you know, the true test of, you know, when I think about assimilation, it's somewhat necessary. It's a good thing. It's valuable if you're able to enculturate yourself to where you are. But it was a teaching opportunity for the folks that cared enough and that didn't tease you to appreciate where you're from and why are you different and why do you eat those things and what language are you talking to? Alan, you're talking this one thing to your grandfather and this other thing to your father. Help me make sense of that. So
you're talking out of both sides of your mouth. Yeah, we understand.
You know, it's tacos one day, it's pierogi another day.
Yeah,
and,
both are good.
And both are good. So you know, definitely there was some teasing, bullying, and so then it becomes okay. At home, it's about values and finding a universal language. Yeah. Amongst peers in the playground, what does that look like? And for me, sports was actually an equalizer. You know, growing up in New York City, you play basketball. That's just the thing. You play basketball, you get on the blacktop in the summer, and basketball was an avenue where it didn't matter what I sounded like, it didn't matter what I looked like. If you could perform on the court, that gave you street cred. And that gave you confidence. Now, it's funny because most kids thought, oh, Alan, you should play soccer, right? Because you're from Mexico, or what do you don't belong on a basketball court. So you have a chip on your shoulder. And it's funny, my father growing up in the 80s, he was all about the Showtime Lakers, Kareem and Magic and James Worthy. So he was, you know, a talented athlete as a younger man. Certainly soccer was his first love, but he loved all sports. And so he noticed right away, soccer is not going to be the thing that allows Alan to make a lot of friends necessarily. Yeah. So let me teach him basketball. And I remember on weekends going to the park with him and using that as a springboard when I was on my own to earn my chops, so to speak, on the basketball court. And between you and I, Michael, I was a pretty talented basketball player.
I was going to ask you that. That was... Well, that is cool, right? So yeah, you went into high school and you got involved in more of that stuff, and I guess earn enough street creds, earn enough credibility, and enough respect that you made it through reasonably unscathed.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think between that and I would say thanks mostly to my mother, if not anything, being a good student and. Of course, it's funny, you know, there's this paradox in the inner cities of being, or maybe it's not exclusive to the inner cities by any means, but what I saw really magnified was if you're good at school, you're a nerd, right? If you're good at school, you're smart and you're not cool, etc. But because I was a good athlete, because I had a good core group of friends and a loving family, for me, being smart was cool.
Yeah.
There was accolades to it. There was recognition for it. And again, as a quote unquote outsider, I was defying a lot of folk stereotypes of what people like me looked like, were supposed to be, right? Lazy or not good at school. And so to be good at school was part of that chip on your shoulder to say, hey, just because my last name is this. Or I'll give you a very humbling example, Michael. When my parents couldn't afford the tuition for the Catholic school, each month when you can't afford the tuition, you don't get your textbooks and you don't get your report card. It's held from you until your family's able to pay tuition. And so I remember not being able to get my textbooks on time or get my report cards on time. But my friends would say, hey, Alan, why don't you come over to our place for a play date, hang out, and I have the books so you can study with us. And so that was an avenue to make friends. And so getting quote unquote good at school was a way to get acceptance.
It's interesting that the mindset was, though, if you don't pay your bills on time, even though you might eventually be able to do it and probably would be eventually able to do it, you don't get your textbooks. In a sense, I can see withholding the report card, but that's a pretty interesting punishment to say you can't have your textbooks and essentially you can't learn. Mm-hmm. Very strange teaching attitude coming from an educational and teaching background somewhat today, but that's too bad that things like that occur.
That's mid-90s inner city education for you. The School of Hard Knocks.
There you go. So what did you do after high school?
So after high school, or even when I was thinking about college, it's funny. My mom and I are so alike in many ways that we butt heads. Right? I'm sure you've heard that before. It's like two magnets just repelling each other. She and I are very close. We're attached in many ways, and she wanted me to stay here in New York City for college. She couldn't fathom me leaving and her baby, right? All that language. So I didn't even give myself the option, Michael. I did not apply to a single college within a 2.5-hour radius of New York City. I wanted to branch out, explore. It wasn't like me, to be honest. I'm naturally, was a shyer person. I've become more outspoken and outgoing, but as a kid, I was pretty reserved, get my head down, right, type of thing. But I said, you know what, I got to use this opportunity to branch out. So my college guidance counselor, she's kind of like a guardian angel to me. She really helped me apply to colleges. All I knew was Manhattan College, where my mom went, and a lot of where my friends were applying. So she said, Alan, I think there's a school in upstate New York, Cornell University, be a great fit for you. It's funny, though, I was very into, obviously, sports and sports journalism at the time. So I said, Miss Ross is her name. I said, is Ithaca like a city? And do they have sports? And she said, it's a city and the college has sports. And so, my ignorance was her advantage. I applied to the school, got into the school without ever seeing it, without ever going, and without knowing anyone who ever went there. But she knew better than I did. And so I went to Cornell, and it was rough in the beginning. I'll be honest with you, Michael. You take a city kid and put him in rural upstate New York. It was culture shock. As street savvy as I was, and as sort of street smart as I consider myself, I was a fish out of water. I didn't like it. It was eerie, almost the silence and the lack of people and the lack of noise was not interesting to me at the time. But it ended up being the greatest thing for me, both personally and sort of pre-professionally, just getting out of my comfort zone, doing a lot of things that I'd never really grown up doing, meeting folks from all over the world, competing in a sense with folks on a different level. I went to a very, very academically rigorous private high school in New York City. And so the academics were actually not that much of a challenge. It was more, how do I get to know different types of people? How do I get them to know me? And I'll share a quick funny story with you. When I was rushing fraternities, that's a big thing up there in Ithaca, in Cornell. We were at this gathering, and the icebreaker was, what's the best birthday gift you ever had as a kid? And I remember saying, "Oh, my video game console, my Nintendo 64, and Domino's Pizza party with my friends." And I thought that was pretty neat. And this one other peer of mine, his was stocks that his uncle had given him as bar mitzvah. And I said, "What do you mean stocks?" And he said, "Oh yeah, I got these stocks and compound interest and they appreciate value. And by the time I graduate college and I'm ready to, purchase a home." And I was like, "Wait a minute. Mine is video games and Domino's Pizza, and yours is
stocks."
And it was such to this day, it's so vivid for me because I said, "How are we the same age? We're both at Cornell University, but you think and operate on such a different plane, not just now, but your whole childhood and young adulthood has what conversations were you having and what is your outlook on life compared to mine?" And that was so groundbreaking for me, Michael, because I said, I need some more of that. I need to know how you're operating, how you're thinking, because that's a world I don't know. My parents have no investment portfolio to speak of. Heck, my grandfather, cash business, driving a cab. I don't know what that means. So college was really eye-opening in so many levels. The classes were great, the academics were cool and all that, but it was more the networking and the people aspect and learning how different folks operate that really, really set me up for success.
So what did you learn from that when he said stocks and so on? How did you then deal with that going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I had interesting conversations with my family about, hey, how are we investing in building multi-generational wealth? To my parents, hey, are you thinking about your pension or your Social Security or investments or rainy day funds or passive income? It was just conversations in language that, again, going back to the earlier part, my parents were doing so much just to get by and survive and put us in a position. They didn't, there's no 25th hour in the day to think about all those other things. So it was really up to me to generate those conversations and think about those things. And then as soon as I became gainfully employed and put myself in a position, I said, I'm going to be, obviously my sister and I are going to be that first generation that really starts to set up our family for success. And so it's led to a lot of, intentional planning and heck, we're not perfect and we're still trying to make it. But it just introduced even my parents and the limited small amount of family I have in this country that we have to think different. We have to operate different. Huge kudos to my parents and all the family that got us here, but there's so much more to learn, so much more to take advantage of, so much more for us to absorb. And it was my kind of small way of paying back, if you will.
What do your parents think about all that?
Oh man, again, they're the best. They're so supportive. They continue to nudge me in all the right ways. And I remember when I graduated from high school, my father said to me, "Alan, this is one of the greatest gifts he's ever given me." He said, "Alan, you're a better and smarter man than I am." And I kind of looked at him confused. And I said, "I'm only 18. I haven't achieved anything." "And what do you mean I'm smarter than you? You've given me so much advice and wisdom." He said, No, I mean, I'll always be your dad and I'll always have advice to give you, but what you're doing, what you're accomplishing, what you're going to accomplish is more than I could ever do, more than I'll ever do. And you should take that to heart. You should know that you can do anything. Don't let anyone tell you can't. You're already proving what so many people in Mexico, even family, doubted. What so many, friends or quote unquote adversaries of yours as a kid doubted. And you're a better man than me for it. My father never knew his father. And so that was, I don't even know my paternal grandfather. I've never seen a picture of him, don't know his name. And so my father's really learning how to be a dad this whole time. And it was almost a little bit of a passing of the torch. Say, hey, you're going to bring honor to the Garcia name in a way that for him, it was shame his whole life. And so he said, you're going to put real honor to that last name and make it mean something. And that has stuck with me to this day.
Yeah, and it should. It also says a lot about him and how he values you. And again, the immediate reaction that I have is it goes back to love. And there's just so much that you guys get to share, which is so great. I never knew my paternal grandfather. My father was orphaned. I don't know exactly how young,
wow.
but by 12 he was, and he lived on his own. And he didn't join the Boy Scouts. There was another program called the Lone Scouts that was a spinoff of the scouting program, and he was part of that. And then later he was a sheep herder. He was a cowboy in Washington State and did other things. He was born in Oklahoma, but moved around and then eventually joined the military. And when in the military, one of the other people around him got him writing to this other guy's sister-in-law. And when the war was over, he went home and he married my mom. And so, so that the other guy was named Sam. So I actually had an Uncle Sam. So it was kind of cool. But, you know, the value, I think that so often parents in the past have put that value on. And I think there's a lot that I wish more people would learn today about the kind of love and the kinds of things that you're talking about here. You talk a lot about navigating the differences in life. Tell me more about what that means and why that's important.
Yeah. So again, it's part of my lived experience. It's how I almost, it's my worldview, you know, where I see difference as opportunity. I see it as what makes life interesting and exciting is learning about our differences, learning about everyone has their own journey, everyone has their own unique past, and it can be a little daunting to meet new folks or share something about yourself with others. But if you're able to have a welcoming demeanor about you, and if you're able to have the courage and bravery to ask questions, to be curious, I have found that through that process, we realize we're actually more alike than we are different. And it's those differences that make for a pleasant conversation and an enduring relationship. It's through that we eventually then find commonality. So it's my worldview, it's my outlook. It's rooted in how I grew up, and it's part of my professional outlook on life, my career as an educator, my philosophy of teaching and learning, but then also in my personal life. My wife is from Bangladesh and she's Muslim, and I grew up Catholic and a kid from Mexico. So even in my personal life, I've always just been intrigued by folks of different backgrounds and their journeys. And it's made life worthwhile.
Same God.
That's right.
If more people would recognize that, still the same God.
That's right. That's right.
Well, you know, I was thinking, I've spent a fair amount of time around New York. I've not spent a lot of time in places like Harlem and so on. But starting in the the mid 70s, and then for many years, I did spend a lot of time around New York, and I had no fear or concern about walking around. I mean, of course, there are always some crazy people, but I felt that if people started accosting me or started treating me in not a good way, it was as much perhaps my behavior that caused them to do that. I go back to the whole idea that, you know, animals can sense fear. And if you're not afraid of animals and you project love, they're not going to bother you like animals will if you're afraid of them. And people are the same way. They can sense how you are. And I personally enjoy talking with people, and I don't care who they are. And I know I've talked to some probably pretty rough people, but, you know, it's okay because I consider them people. Now, one of the things that did happen to me in New York a few times is I would leave the hotel I was staying at when I was back there doing sales and so on. And these people, they got to know me. They came up and they said, "We're part of the guardian angels. We'll take care of you. Make sure you don't have any problems." And I said, "Look, I'm not going to have any problems. It's not a big deal." They wanted to walk with me anyway, and I let them. But, you know, the thing is that I believe that we are really a reflection of how people are going to treat us. If we hate, that's going to rub off. Then people are going to sense it. If we love, that's going to rub off and people are going to sense it. And I would much prefer the latter to the former. And I've found always that it was pleasant to be around people, no matter who they were. And I've met some homeless people who I'm sure were pretty rough people, but we're all part of the same race of people.
That's right. Yeah, I'm with you there. And again, if we can have the courage and bravery to, on the one hand, both be a little vulnerable, but then also welcome folks where they are on their journey. I have found that more often than not to be a pretty pleasant interaction.
Yeah. Well, what did you do after college? So you went to Cornell. You didn't go into hotel management or any of those things up there. That's okay.
No, yeah, the
I can't hit you up for a good rate, but
Yeah, the hoteliers, as they're called. That was not my path. I was studying sports journalism and communication media studies, but I was minoring in education and sort of the formal, everything from the history of formal education in this country, how it came about, to the financing, to different educational models, Montessori, public, emerging charter schools. Charter schools were really hot at that time. Some of the biggest charter school networks were just beginning to pop up in the major cities. And it was really through understanding, or trying to understand, the systemic inequity that's been built in to our public education system, but then even lack of access to private education, and even how things like real estate and redlining and all these other sort of socioeconomic factors contribute to education. That blew my mind, because again, I look back at my own story, and by that time I was well versed in the fact that I was a statistical anomaly, and the odds of a quote unquote kid like me making it to a quote unquote place or places like I did that was slim. But I never let that limit my belief that it can be more common. More people can do it. And so I pursued graduate studies in education at the University of Pennsylvania, graduate school there. Got my master's in education. Really, really kind of a deep dive into why are things the way they are, and seeing things from an assets-based approach. So not so much, okay, why don't things work? That's been documented and well-versed, but given the circumstances that we know exist that contribute to why certain demographics or certain sectors of the population don't achieve, who are the young people that even in those spaces and those circumstances are succeeding? So how do they find a way? How are the schools or the quote unquote village, if you will, producing enough success in spite of or despite the traditional barriers? And then can we replicate what works? So it's one thing to avoid what doesn't, but can we systematize and create sort of philosophies of thinking and then operationalize the stuff that does? And so I was part of a really interesting research team. This is 2013. We were actually contracted by the New York City Department of Education. It was a team of 12 graduate researchers led by our professor, Dr. Sean Harper, who's now at USC. And the DOE contracted us to examine 40 Title I public high schools in New York City and interview what ended up being over 400 Black and Latino male students. That is a demographic that historically has the lowest levels of high school graduation, college matriculation, graduating college within 6 years, all these statistics that we know well. But these 40 schools found ways to graduate this particular demographic above the national rate, and then through their alumni services, track them through college and find that they were actually graduating from college, again, above the national rate when compared to peers of their same socioeconomic status. So we said, okay, these schools are finding a way to do it. These young men are doing it. So we studied that. We produced a whole report for the DOE. And it was interesting because we called the study Finding Ourselves. All of the researchers from the University of Pennsylvania, myself included, were Black and Latino men.
Mm.
and from all parts of the country, but we just happened to be studying the same university. And so we were, in a way, rediscovering the younger version of ourselves and finding a way to produce a report and produce a list of recommendations that New York City could follow and any other major sort of urban city could follow and say, hey, these are the schools that are doing it. This is how they're doing it. This is how they're staffing it. This is how they're building their class schedules. These are the additional and requisite supports that this particular demographic is receiving. And then even after they graduate from college, this is what the schools are doing in the post-secondary space. And that was really neat for me because I'm studying in Philly at Penn, but every week we were traveling to New York City and doing this study. So it was a way for me to stay close to home in a way. And that really, I caught the bug there of both being a practitioner in a sense, being in schools on a weekly basis, but then also doing the research. And I said, hey, I want to make a career out of this. I found that just through sharing my story and providing families with nothing revolutionary, Michael, just access to information and pathways that they otherwise didn't have access to, or wasn't made, it wasn't made simple enough for them to understand. I could really do something here. And so that's what I did after college. And then I pursued a career in education formally after that.
I definitely want to hear a little bit more about that and what you're doing now, but I'm curious about something just because I'm not as knowledgeable about as I probably would love to be. But tell me more about what you think about the whole concept of charter schools and where they fit into the world. Are they more of a blessing or not?
Yeah, I think unfortunately charter schools and that question has produced a knee-jerk either yes or no answer. And I think there's more nuance there. Because I'm for family choice and families having options, right? Historically, if you're zoned to your local public school, depending on your zip code, and that school is overcrowded or it's under-resourced or you just want your child to go somewhere else, that was very, very limiting through the late 90s, early 2000s, the beginning of voucher programs and families having to apply for vouchers and have a little bit of school choice. We're well behind in families understanding how to navigate that system. So charter schools allow families to do that. Now it's lottery, right? So it's not guaranteed, but it still gives them choices. And I'm all for family choice. I think it's a good thing generally. The culture that sometimes charter schools, but not exclusive to charter schools, is by design a little bit more rigid, perhaps a little bit more accountability than your traditional public school or maybe even a private secular or parochial school. And so I think they sometimes get a bad rap because there's private funding in charter schools and they model a sort of more business oriented approach to pedagogy and learning. And I think it straddles that world between we want to offer families choice, but this is going to look and feel different than what most parents went to as a kid because the charter schools weren't around. I mean, now you're starting to see the first ever second generation charter school families, but because it's just a little foreign and it's not, again, what we did back in my day, right? If you're a parent, there can be some resistance to it, but at any school, whether you're charter, public, traditional public, right? Because charters are technically public schools, or private, you're going to have good educators, you're going to have bad educators. You're going to have good teachers, you're going to have bad teachers.
Yeah.
And so across the board, we need to train our teachers better, and that's actually what my master's thesis at Penn was about. It was how antiquated our teacher training and preparation programs are and how they're not immersive enough. And then you do all that work, you go to higher ed, you get a graduate degree, you're putting yourself now in astronomical debt. And at least in New York City, your starting salary is $40,000. But you're tasked with the world. And I saw that paradox when I was at Cornell. And I told a lot of my friends, particularly my friends' parents, oh, I'm going to go into education. And they were all so bummed out, Michael. They looked at me and said, oh, Alan, you wasted your Cornell education. Oh, gee, you're going to go into teaching. Oh, what a bummer. And I said to myself, how ironic is this that all of these parents here, because I was on scholarship at Cornell, I didn't want to put my parents into any debt. All these parents are at that time accruing probably $250,000 of student loans and debt so that their kids could have the best teachers and the best credentials. But God forbid someone who's well credentialed wants to go into education, right? It never made sense to me. So many parents want their kids to go to these Ivy League schools, top tier private schools, and they look at where the teachers, oh, you went to Princeton, you went to Williams, you went to Columbia. Wow, that's where I want my kid to go to school. But God forbid someone like me chooses to go to education and not a career in finance or business management or healthcare, be a doctor. Oh, Alan, you wasted it. And I would push back to my parents and my friends' parents and folks that thought about that. Because I want the philosophy around what it means to be an educator in this country to be held in high esteem, in high regard. It starts there. It starts with that attitude. If we don't have that, then how are we going to hold our educators accountable? And how are they going to feel really proud of what they do?
And that was what I was actually going to get to, is that the other part of it is, besides training and really giving teachers all the training that they should have, is giving teachers all the support that they should have, and truly being involved in your child's education and in the educational system, because our future really depends on it. But people don't do that.
Exactly. We don't. And so that's sort of when I get on my pulpit and and try and get folks to all across the board, from kids to parents to my colleagues to folks outside of the education space proper, to think more about how we view education generally. I have often found, you talk to anyone and say, hey, who are some influential people in your life? Somewhere in their top 5 will be a teacher. Somewhere in top 5 will be an educator. And I'll say to them, yeah, that same, regard you have for that person, that same love you have for that person. Imagine if you had that for all your teachers. And in turn, the educators in that space would learn to feel more appreciated, to feel like, both from just a purely economic financial perspective, but then also the esteem that comes with the position. If we're just seen as a kind of a backup job or something that, oh, you didn't cut it elsewhere, so you became a teacher, that's not helping anybody.
No, and it's not true.
Right.
I'm very blessed that one of my top 5 people is a teacher. He was my sophomore geometry teacher, and we stay in touch. He's That's 86. Awesome. I went to his birthday and surprised him when he turned 80. Wow. He came to my wife's and my wedding 40 years ago, now over 40 years ago. And, I always enjoyed him and so many other teachers. I was blessed with good teachers. And then when I was at University of California, Irvine, and in graduate school, I also got my secondary teaching credential. So I went through the School of Education there, and Ken Bailey and the people at the school were great. And they gave me a lot of opportunity and didn't care that I happened to be blind. And that was great. If they cared, it never showed to me. But I got to be a student teacher at local high school, teaching physics and math, and had great master teachers as well. And I've got to say, I just have nothing but praise for the whole concept of teaching. And my belief is that we all are teachers anyway. And people are always asking me about being blind. Well, I'm a teacher, right? And I shouldn't resent or take offense at people asking questions, and don't. I'd rather take the time to answer questions and teach. For most of my adult life, I was in sales. And I believe that good salespeople, real salespeople, are teachers. And they're also learners, because the good salesperson might suddenly recognize my product isn't what this customer needs. And sometimes it's tough to make the ethical choice to say to the customer, this isn't going to work for you, but here's what will. But the reality is it will always come back. If you are open and honest and gain someone's trust, it'll come back to support you in the end.
100%. Yeah. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. And so I really am just always so frustrated when I hear a lot of things going on with teachers. I mean, even today, where we talk about or hear about all the books that are being banned, and you got to sit there and go, have you read them? Do you know? Or are you just going by what someone else said? And of course, usually They haven't read them. They don't know.
Right, right.
For a while, people were really going after Dr. Seuss. He's a racist and all that. But I was watching something last week, and they said, the people who were reporting said over time, he changed. And if he had more racist comments, or what we're deciding now are racist comments early on, that wasn't the case later in his life.
I see. Yeah.
Which is interesting. But we should value education, and we should do more to recognize the high value that it brings to all of us.
Agreed.
So you, in addition to, so exactly what are you doing today? What's your job today?
Sure. So I work for a pretty innovative secondary ed educational model. The school is called Cristo Rey Brooklyn High School. The Cristo Rey model is a national model. It's a private secondary ed network. It's a Catholic network. 38 high schools in 30 cities, coast to coast, everywhere from Miami to Seattle and all corners in between. And the really innovative thing, no matter where we are, it says three things. So on the one, every Cristo Rey school is designed to serve a population, a demographic that otherwise could not afford or access private education. So I'll give you an example here. Locally in New York, the average Catholic high school tuition annually is $10,000 a year, and the average private high school tuition, including other schools other than Catholic schools, is $20,000 a year. And so our tuition is capped at $2,500 a year. No family will ever pay more than that. And we only charge families what they can afford. So each family is on an individualized payment plan relative to their income. And we vet that in admissions. We collect all sorts of paperwork. The average family contribution is at around $1,000 a year. So we want to make this a very affordable and accessible option. It's a college preparatory experience. So that's on the one, is who we serve. And no matter where we are, that's what we do. The second is every single student from freshman year through senior year will go to school 4 days a week and actually intern at a company in corporate America, private America, 1 day a week, all 4 years of high school. And so you could imagine you go to school Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and your internship day is Wednesday. And you do that all years of high school. The students get deployed on the day, depending on what grade they're in. So on one day, so for example, I said Wednesday, that's the senior work day. All seniors are out of the building interning. The rest of the students are in the building, but then the seniors go to school the other 4 days of the week. So it's the same experience for every grade. That is combining both a college preparatory education and a youth workforce development, giving the students real work-life experience. Because again, this population tends to be first generation, tends to be immigrant population, lower income population, who will likely be the first in their family to do a lot of things. So we want to sort of close the achievement gap, and we have found that these two things are a recipe for success. On a national scale, the most recent numbers, right, of a few years ago, the national aggregate Cristo Rey High School students on a national level are graduating from college 6 times the national rate of students in a similar demographic who don't go to Cristo Rey high schools. Now we know we're a small sample size nationally, but it's the scope is wide enough that we said, hey, there's something about this work thing that's different.
Yeah.
So that's number 2. Number 3 is every school's funding model. So because families only pay what they can afford, and in our school in Brooklyn, that's about 10% of our operating budget annually, the revenue we generate through the work-study program, the internship program, that money funds the school. So I get this question all the time, Mr. Garcia, when am I getting my paycheck? Right? The kids, they don't get a paycheck. A company will pay the school, exchange a fee for service, and collectively in the aggregate, those funds, each student is a price tag essentially on each student employee, each student worker. It's $10,000 a year from Labor Day through the end of June. Their work year models an academic school year. Each company will pay for an intern. And that money collectively for us is about 60% of our operating budget. And so that's what literally keeps our lights on. It's what subsidizes the child's education, and allows this experience to be affordable and keep prices down for everyone. Now, you mentioned before sales, Michael, but my job is to actually go out and sell this educational model, this idea to companies and say, hey, we have a young, motivated, excited workforce that likely your company, corporate America, doesn't have access to for a whole host of reasons. Where these kids live, the fact that they're first generation. We exclusively serve students of color at our school, and a lot of companies are looking to increase the number of employees of color they have. So an organic pipeline of talent that you can say you've built a relationship with organically since they were teenagers. And then I also want to do what's right by the kids, right? I want them to have an educational experience both at school and at the workplace. So finding the supervisors in the workplaces that are willing to work with the younger population, mentor them almost on an apprenticeship model, and show them the ropes. And so the more partners we're able to get, the more money our school can get and the more experiences our students can have. And so that's what I do. That's the school I work at. And I'm, as I mentioned before, I'm the vice president of the corporate work study program. So I oversee all program management, external client relations, student formation, and then curating those experiences both for the students and the clients.
Do you do any teaching also in the school itself, or
I don't do it? Yeah, I don't do any formal classroom teaching. I'm in front of students a lot, but not in a formal teaching sense.
But it's cool. It's exciting to see what's happening, and especially when you see these numbers of 6 times the average, the national average. That is really cool.
Yeah. It's a really sort of radical model, if you will, to walk into a school and be able to talk to a 15-year-old and say, "Hey, where do you work?" And they say, "Oh, I work at American Express," and to hear the kids talk about it, and I visit them at all their work sites, and so to see the confidence and the fluency with which they operate that part of the world that, again, I think most adults are still learning how to navigate corporate America.
Yeah.
Our kids are exposed to that and getting training there. And it translates. They realize, hey, I can do this. Even if no one in my family's done this, or no one in my neighborhood has done this, I have that additional support. And the supervisors really rally around the kids and take time out of their day. And so, we talked before about love and all the ingredients for this. It takes just the right mix of the right partner to make this work. And so it's really, really cool work.
So what do you do when you're not on the job? What are your extracurricular activities?
It's funny, if you ask my wife, she'd say all I do is work.
Yeah.
Even in my personal life, I'm talking about work and talking about education and all that. But honestly, I'm a big sports buff.
I kind of figured that had to show up somewhere.
I'm a big I love baseball, love the Yankees. I grew up playing basketball, as I mentioned before. That was kind of my thing. I don't get on the court as much as I used to. Last year, I actually had a pretty devastating leg injury. I tore my ACL, MCL, and had a bone fracture in my right leg. Pretty much shattered my leg playing basketball. Had to have reconstructive knee surgery, very intensive physical therapy. I haven't really been on a basketball court since, but thankfully I'm recovered to the point where another passion and hobby I took up even before the injury was running. I got into running, and not just leisurely, but also participating in things like half marathons and 10Ks and 5Ks. And so as part of my rehab, I'm actually running the New York City half marathon in 2 weeks. It's on March 19th. It'll be the most that I've exerted myself since the injury. But it's a race I've done before, a race I really enjoy. And so I'm using it both as a personal marker of my health, but also to my students and to folks in my extended, network of, when life knocks you down, quite literally, you pick yourself up and you work harder. And I remember when I fell on the basketball court, I literally, Michael, could not pick myself up. My teammates had to carry me, and I was on crutches for a long time, and I had to literally lean on people to get through life. And so I want to prove to myself, first and foremost, my others, that with a strong support system and putting in the hard work and really appreciating my life even before I had the injury in a new way, that you can come back out stronger. And so I've been training for that. I've been running. And that'll be a pretty neat milestone coming up in a few weeks.
You've been through a lot. You've obviously accomplished a lot, and you've experienced a lot. What's one piece of advice you would give to people who are listening to this?
I'd say never give up. When life potentially closes a door or presents an obstacle, have a backup plan, or try and think of how you can change or pivot, and don't allow the setbacks or the challenges to defeat you. See them as a way for you to learn a new skill, or learn something you didn't know you had deep down in you, that we all do. We're much more versatile, and we're much more we can adapt a lot more if we really believe in it. If we don't think we can, or we have a defeatist mindset, then
we won't.
Then we won't. So I think it's to never give up, and see every challenge and again different, something different in life as an opportunity to learn and grow.
Yeah, it's really, I don't want to insult anyone, but it's really as simple as that. You can decide to take everything that happens to you as a learning experience or not. And that's your choice. It's also like, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. It's the reality is that we really can make good choices, and we can make choices that can be good. It's really up to us. If we're negative, then that's going to be a problem. If we're positive, we'll find ways to succeed.
That's right. That's right.
Well, I want to thank you, Alan, for being here. This has been a lot of fun. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope that you out there listening have enjoyed it. If people want to maybe reach out to you or learn more about the Cristo Rey schools or any of that sort of stuff, how might they do that?
Sure. So you can go right on our website, Cristo Rey Brooklyn, and you'll see my contact information there. You can go on my LinkedIn, search me up, Alan Garcia. You can come visit us in East Flatbush. Either find my contact information on my LinkedIn or on our website. Be more than happy to strike up a conversation, grab a cup of coffee, or even host you at our school. Always looking to meet new folks.
Do you know anybody back there who is still saying that someday the Dodgers are going to move back to Brooklyn?
No,
just checking.
I think folks have given up on that one.
I don't know. I was in New York a few years ago, and somebody said one of these days they're coming back. So.
Well, there's a lot more interleague play.
There is. There is absolutely that. That's true.
There's that.
Well, I want to thank you again, and I want to thank you for listening to us today. I hope that you enjoyed it. I would appreciate it, and I'm sure Alan would, if wherever you're listening, you give us a 5-star rating, especially go to Apple and go to iTunes and give us a 5-star rating. We would really appreciate you doing that and love your comments. And Alan, for you and for anyone listening, if you know anyone who might be a good guest or you think would be a good guest on Unstoppable Mindset, want to hear from you about them. We really appreciate that. You can reach me a couple different ways. One is to go to our podcast website, www.michaelhingson.com/podcast, and Michael Hingson is MichaelHingson, one word, michaelhingson.com/podcast, or email me at michaelhi@accessibe.com. Love to hear from you, and I hope that you will give us some good comments, and again, especially the 5-star ratings. We love those. Appreciate you doing that. And we hope that you'll be back with us again next week to have another episode, or the next time we're on. We've been doing 2 of these a week actually for quite a while now. And Alan, we appreciate you contributing to that. And once more, I want to thank you for being with us and spending over an hour with us today.
This was a lot of fun, Michael. Really appreciate the opportunity and hanging out with you.